So could you just say your name and just a little bit of background just to begin?
Well, my name is Robert Mertens, and background as relevant to Subud. I was opened March 27th, 1967 in New York, and have been a member since then, all that time.
Very good. Can you say how you found Subud and how you eventually came into Subud?
Yes, I can. After graduating from college in Middlebury, Vermont as a chemistry major, but knowing that art was my thing, I started hitchhiking around until I got to the West Coast. When I couldn't hitchhike any further, I had a little bit of money left, so I took a $100 plane fare to Hawaii, maybe even cheaper nowadays. And the only thing I really knew how to do was be a student. So I went over to the University of Hawaii and asked for admittance into the graduate program in art. But since I didn't have enough credits to qualify for that, they did admit me as an unclassified student, and which meant that I could take the art courses, and at the end of 6 months, the head of the department could determine whether I could become a regular graduate student in art. So I did that, and the head of the department happened to be the art history teacher. I've always had a good imagination when I look at pictures as to what they mean. So I wrote papers that really impressed him. It mostly just came off the top of my head, but I was admitted as a regular graduate student at that time, and lived for the first couple of semesters at a place called the East-West Center, where there were other students that came from Asia, from Bangladesh and India and Vietnam, that were my fellow residents in the East-West Center. So I got to meet quite a few interesting people from Asia. After a little while, my kind of money ran out for living in the East-West Center, so I went looking for other accommodations, and I found some in a basement of a house nearby where the basement was divided into 8 rooms. And there were 8 different, mostly students, I think, occupying those rooms for very little money. So I moved in there. At the same time, I was going to a place where young college students could meet called the, what was it called? It was actually a coffee house in a building behind a church called the Church of the Crossroads. And I was, after a while, given a little studio in a shed out back because they knew I was an art student. And I learned something interesting. The pastor there would listen to the news every Sunday and deliver his sermon based on what came over the news. It was a very, you might say, progressive church in that they made this place for students. Also, students were investigating the world of drugs at that time. It was a brand new thing, and I, in particular, was very curious about the experience. So over the next 2 years, I had a lot of drug experiences and a lot of stories. I won't go into them at the moment. We'll just make this kind of a Reader's Digest version. But with my drug experiences, I knew that there was something spiritual beyond my everyday normal experience. And things could happen in that state of awareness that could not happen. Maybe they were happening in my regular state of awareness, but I never noticed them. At any rate, I became very curious, started reading. I went to the library, and what I would do sometimes is just to walk among the bookshelves and watch my hand go out and take a book off the shelf. And one of the books I got that really intrigued me was a book by Uspensky called Meetings with Remarkable Men, And then I started to read about Gurdjieff. At the same time, I kind of took up yoga with the local psychiatrist, and he had a beautiful place. He and his wife had a beautiful place right on the shore, and a grassy place, and we all go do yoga there once a week. Learned how to stand on my head and do yoga practices, which I sometimes did when I was in the drug experiences to settle myself or to become more into it.
Yeah.
My drug experiences led me into a moment, and it's part of another longer story, where I almost lost my life climbing a cliff under the influence of LSD. And I was doing what I often did, which was questing. For me, drug trips often turned onto a quest to understand more, go deeper, that kind of thing. And as a result, the experiences I had became kind of cosmic and strangely mixed up with some celebrities at the time too, notably the mothers of invention. That's also a fairly long story, and perhaps for another time, so we'll keep this as to a Reader's Digest version. At any rate, after 2 years, I got my master's degree in fine arts, but didn't know what to do with it. I knew that art had to be my path, but my father I knew at age 7, it suddenly came to me that I wanted to be an artist. And I waited for my father to come home from his work. He came home, pretty much a very regular guy, came home every day, same train mostly. And when he finally got home, I was so excited. I could hardly wait all afternoon to tell him what I wanted to be when I grew up, so to speak. I said, Dad, I know what I want to be. He said, well, what is it? Tell me, what is it? And he always said, you can be anything you want to be. So that's up to you. I didn't have to follow any of the family traditions. I said, I want to be an artist, Dad. There's a moment of silence. Turned out that was the one thing of all the things that I wanted to be that I could not be.
Yeah.
After a moment of silence, Dad said to me, art is an interesting avocation, but it's not a vocation. He said, the only 2 words I know that describe artists are broke and crazy. And my father had been through the Depression and the inflation in Germany after the First World War, the incredible hardships that most of the people were undergoing as a result of them. I could wax and rant about the result of the Treaty of Versailles and how it precipitated the Second World War. And we keep making the same mistake over and over again by wreaking revenge on our so-called enemies, but that's a rant. So I'll save that for another time. Graduated from the University of Hawaii, got a master's degree in art, but didn't know what to do with it. So I did what any upstanding hippie at that time. I didn't really consider myself a hippie, but other people I considered myself an explorer in the realms of spirit. I did Zen sitting for a while in Hawaii too, kind of looking for something. So I hitchhiked back to New York, met a friend from Hawaii. He was taking care of his grandfather's farm, 650-acre, kind of a gentleman's farm. His grandfather was a doctor, actually. But I went to visit him near Lexington, Kentucky, a little place where his grandfather's farm was. And he said, I asked him what was doing with him. We took some acid and had a nice trip and looked at the Oriental rugs, which his grandfather collected in his journeys in India and around Asia. And, looked into them while we were high and had really nice experiences. And he said, we had a mutual friend who was a DJ in Hawaii in a place called KPOI. It was the local radio station. So when musical celebrities came from the mainland, they would stop in, and the DJs would bring them up to our apartment after their visit to, hang out.
Mhm.
So I got to meet some of the people and they figure prominently into one of my stories in particular, but we'll leave that for another time as well. So I met him on his grandfather's farm. We spent about a week together, and I said, well, what do you hear about the people we knew in Hawaii? And he said, well, one of the DJs at KPOI, a guy named Bob Prescott, is in the village now. He's managing the Figaro Coffee and Chess Center, where all the beat people came to play chess and exchange ideas. He's managing that, and he's discovered something called Subud. I said, David, what is Subud? He said, I can't really tell you, but as far as I can tell, a bunch of people go into an executive's office on Madison Avenue somewhere, and into a way up high place, which intrigued me. They close the door and something happens, but nobody knows what it is. So that sounded quite curious and interesting to me. So when I got back to New York, I looked up Prescott at the Figaro, and he said, yeah, if you're interested in finding out about Subud, come to it was called a probationers meeting at that time. I never liked the name very much, and many people didn't, because it sounds like you're in jail and you're going out on probation, which in a way is kind of true. But so he said, come to my place, my apartment, we'll smoke a joint at DMT, and then we'll go over to the meeting. So I went over to the meeting. There were a bunch of mostly older guys there, a few younger people interested in Subud. Some of the original members in Subud, Ferry Farkas and Francis von Kahler, and there's a crew of, we consider them elderly. I guess they were in their young 60s at the time. Seemed very old to us. So I went to a couple of meetings, and I learned that, there's no dogma particular, although I found out later people had dogma. Subud members had dogma, although there's no official dogma.
Yeah.
Went to a few meetings and was super eager to get open. I figured it was going to be acid experiences without acid. I had learned I started, I guess, attending these meetings when I got back in September, and 3 months went by, and I expected the helpers to contact me to come and receive the opening experience. Nobody did. Silence of the tomb pervaded. I said, oh, well, maybe they're waiting a little longer for some reason. Finally, it was 3.5 months or something. And I said, I better check this out. So I called them up, and they said, well, you didn't ask to be open. I expected that you would ask me to be open. I came because I wanted to be open. I mean, that seemed to be the whole purpose of coming to these meetings for 3 months. Anyway, they said, okay, we'll arrange it. So they did arrange it. And I was, my thoughts and feelings and passions were at a very high level, an expectation of what might happen to me. I was expecting kind of heavenly or out of body experiences, or strange experiences from other dimensions, like I had experienced with acid. So I went, and interestingly enough, the person in the helpers group who opened me was the person who was exactly the opposite of me in the helpers group, the person I would have least kind of wanted to read me the opening statement. I'm forgetting his name right now. A longtime Subud member, died a few years ago. But he was really straight-laced. He came wearing a tie and maybe a vest, and he was doing a 9-to-5 job. And here I was, just fresh from Hawaii. I had gotten involved with some people in the village in a cooperative gallery, and so we were coming from opposite ends of the cultural spectrum. And of course, God made it that he would choose that man to read me my opening statement. That's the way it always happens. I mean, you can expect it in Subud. There are infinite stories about that. Anyway, I received I said the opening statement, heard what it was, did my best to stand quietly and surrender and receive, but it was pretty much nothing. I don't know, there may have been something there, but I was too busy thinking to notice whatever might have been going on. And I had nothing like a drug to throw me out of my usual state of awareness. So, but I felt this has got to be it. I mean, everything that was said about it was exactly right. I just, it rang true with me. So I kept coming, kept coming. After a little while, I became chairman of the group and enraged the older helpers by helping to get Papa's visit to New York moved to Skymont to Virginia. But that's another long story. There's lots of stories about the early days of Subud kind of in the library in here,
Yeah.
but it would take many days to tell them all. So I'll keep this as to the Reader's Digest version. So, after about a year or so in Subud, there needed to be a chairman. And it was Isman Kanofsky and me that were the two possibles at that moment, both very young at that time. And he was quite the opposite of me too. He's a by the book kind of man, the book as he understands it. And I was, see what comes and deal with it as best you can kind of a person. But we were the two choices for chair. But as in these days, Muhammad could give trouble to the helpers. And so the helpers received actually on who would be the best chair, and it turned out to be me. So I was chair for 3 years. It was a one-year term, and each year I became chair again. It was hard because there weren't that many people willing to be chair. It was mostly trouble. And then people that became chair usually left after their year term. Yeah. But I kind of like being chair. I don't know, I fit somehow in that position. I became actually a career chair in Subud. Huh. Being chair of every kind of committee you could imagine so far, except for the world chair at this moment. Yeah. So I don't think I'll ever be the world chair. We'll take maybe a younger person with more worldly skills than I have. At any rate, let's see. After 3 years, I was up for chair again, but Helena stood up and said, "Don't vote for him. Don't make him chair anymore. It's too much trouble." So
your wife?
My wife,
Yeah.
Helena. So they voted me down at that point, and then I became chair of the region, of course. At any rate.
Can you talk a little bit about any kind of experiences that you've had with Bapak?
Oh, yes, I did have experiences with Bapak. Bapak was coming to New York semi-regularly every few years. And I would go, I remember the first time that Bapak was in New York, he had one of the nights where he was going to do testing. It was at a place we rented near the UN. I think it was owned by the UN. We rented this large place. But since it was going to be testing, I had enough testing in college. I wasn't really interested, so I didn't go. Later on, I learned it was something a little bit different that could help you in your spiritual progress. So I went. One of the experiences I had, we have in New York, Subud member, still there, longtime member, very interesting and individual person named Walter Siegel. You probably know him or certainly know of him. But anyway, Papa was good.
Say his name again.
Walter Siegel.
Okay, yeah.
He's an iconic New York member and an iconic New Yorker as well.
Okay.
So we were receiving, and Papa was doing a particular test. How is it when you're in front of someone that has not a very good character? What happens? And there's all this hullabaloo goes up, and there's retching and wailing and shouting. No, kind of finished. No. It's not like that. What you just do is you just turn your head a little bit away and walk on, That's how it is. And then how is it when you're in front of somebody with a very good character and all these kind of, heavenly utterances are rising from the 300 or so men that are there. But above that whole somewhat of a din, louder than all of it, is the voice of Walter Siegel. And Walter says, "Well, hello there. I didn't know you existed." Oh, there are many funny stories about Walter. He's also a very fine chess player. He would play chess with Lauren Brady, who played chess with Bobby Fischer at that time. So, I mean, all kinds of stuff. So, I don't know, where do we go from here? Oh, Bapa.
Yeah.
One of the experiences I had some years later, Bapa was still alive and coming to New York regularly and staying at one of the hotels. And I volunteered to be a driver for Bapa and his party. And came my turn. And what usually happened in a center, and it happened in our center, is when Bapa was about to come, there was a lot of fighting and disagreement and, I don't know, jockeying for position or something. And I was kind of disgusted at this. So I was sitting around with the other drivers, and I thought I'd say something that would maybe kind of jolt people out of their, wherever they were, or I imagined they were. So I said, what do you think would happen if I asked Baba to drive me to the center when he came out? So it did get some kind of a shocking reaction. Like, nobody said anything too much. I just let it ride. So here I am waiting out next to the open car door, standing next to the car door. And Baba came out of the Hotel Washington, I think is where he was, on Lexington Avenue. And he's striding down the steps, you know, regal. Later on, someone described to me that his helpers were like destroyers and he was like an aircraft carrier as he approached the group. So he came down the steps, you know, like he is. And as he got close to the car, he seemed to make a gesture that I want him to sit in the driver's seat. At that particular moment, all my fuses blew. And I kind of stumbled around and babbled something like, no, Bobby, you sit in the back seat. Fortunately, so there I am, ready to drive Baba, and I did. And fortunately, there's something about driving. I always liked driving. I was able to drive peacefully and safely a few blocks down to the center at the South Gate. It was called the South Gate at that time, where the meeting was being held, and let him off. And I remembered that for a long time, and I wondered about it, various things like, did he know? How did he know? Or didn't he know? And it was just, or did he and didn't he know both? The power of God is somehow moving him to do what's required.
Yeah.
For each of us. But it did occur to me that, you know, the power of God, at least, is looking on all the time. So whatever you say, especially if it's in the presence of a prophet, stuff is liable to happen.
Yeah.
For some people, it was shit hitting the fan, but for me, it was just always mysterious and unusual experiences.
Yeah.
Later on, I drove Virendra, and I'll tell this one story, and then maybe we'll pack it in for today. The drugs, I wondered what they were really. The last trip I took in Hawaii was with the purest and best acid from the Sandoz laboratory that originally purified it, and from bread molds, and they made it into a droplets. You know, they obtained the essence of what it was in a fluid, an oil, I guess, LSD. And we heard in Hawaii that you could get some Sandoz acid at that time from a certain source. And so for me and my friend, we put our money together and bought 7 caps. So when the caps came, the capsules looked like they were empty. They were called space caps, we learned later, I think. They looked like they were empty. So anyway, we figured it must be in there. We had learned that people put it on the back of postage stamps, a droplet of this stuff, and sent it in the mail as a way of sending it around. So we opened the cap, assuming that there was some acid on the cap. We each took half and we went off. So it was beautiful, you know, sometimes with Owsley's acid or the acid made in the local labs by various scientists in California, there was an edge to it. Owsley's acid was called blue cheer. People from that time will remember because it was a blue powder. It was a soap called blue cheer, which cleaned up your laundry at that time. So, but this was smooth. There was no edge to it, nothing. It was just smooth. It was hard, you hardly knew. But it began to come on pretty strongly. It felt good. But then something inside me said, this is wrong. This is wrong. I knew at that moment it was wrong. So I took the other 6 caps. I went back home and I flushed them down the toilet and waited for it to wear off. It was a very nice experience. It was kind of, you know, a more vivid experience, perhaps, of normal waking reality. I didn't go questing, so I didn't have any adventures, which I can tell you about some of the other ones, which were adventures. But the next day I went back and we compared notes. I said, well, how was it? He said, nothing. It was absolutely nothing. I said, I had a really powerful experience, but I realized that I had to stop doing acid. I didn't stop doing acid. I took one more trip back home, which is the story of my incarceration in a mental facility. But it's another story. I said, I flushed them down the toilet. He said, you what? You flushed them down the toilet? He later came into Subud. He was one of the few people that came into Subud through me. He came into Subud through me.
Do you remember his name?
Tom Smith.
Tom Smith. Okay.
I think he's still living in Hawaii and still a Subud member, if I'm not mistaken. I said, yeah, I realized it's wrong. I had to do it. I said, here's your half of the money. He was disappointed, but you know, he realized, okay, that's what happened.
Yeah.
So I'm driving Virindra sometime after I had driven Bapa. I'm driving Virindra around, and I said to Virindra, do you know what the drugs are, what the drug experiences are? He said, no, but at the time that I, first came into Subud, I was traveling around the world somewhat as Bapa's emissary to find out what the people were thinking, like that guy Harun el-Rashid, who used to go out in disguise at night to see what the people were really thinking and really doing. So he sent Virindra out in that way to hear the stories and the desires and what was going on with Subud people. And drugs was a prime subject at that moment, especially among the younger people. So he asked Bapa, he said, Bapa, what are the drugs? Bapa said, he took a moment to do what he usually does. He said, in the spirit, you have heard me speak that there are 7 levels of spirit. And in each level, there are 7 levels of spirit. So 49 altogether. Interestingly enough, it's the number of sticks you toss in the I Ching. There's 49 sticks you toss if you're doing the yarrow version. So there's 40.
I didn't hear what that last thing was.
There's if you're throwing the sticks, the yarrow sticks, doing that method in the I Ching, which being somewhat of a purist, I would do when I was using I Ching rather than the 3 coins method. There are 49 sticks in the yarrow pack that you throw to receive the message from the I Ching, as well as 49 levels of spirit that Virindra was saying that Bapa said at that moment. He said, in each level, in each of the 7 levels, there are 7 levels within that level. The drug plants, and there's some spirits and souls that are ascending in each level, and some that are descending in each level. The drugs are the highest level of the vegetable force. And so when you take a drug, you spend most of your time, and most humans do, at the material level, the level of thought. Thought is inspired and moved by the material level. And you can kind of tell this because when you have a thought or an imagination, you're looking at stuff, mostly.
Mhm.
You know, when I have a vision, there's stuff in the vision. Even my receivings are, I see something and then I try and interpret what it is that I'm seeing. He said that most of us humans spend our time in the material level. So when we are immediately raised to the highest level of the vegetable realm, we are in paradise. And it's a very powerful attraction to spend some time in paradise. It's the vegetable level of paradise. So just to put the cap on this story, it was just as I was coming into Subud, I had stopped drugs. I came in on March 27th. I had my last LSD trip where I wound up in the mental hospital on January 1st with my friend who brought it from Hawaii. Had my last LSD trip. So this is about 3 months later, I'm being opened. And then maybe a month or so, a few weeks after that, I had a dream. And in this dream, did you ever see Being John Malkovich? It's a movie.
I think
It's a movie. On the 13th floor, there are these guys that kind of are masters of reality. You can go into another life by being sent down a chute, but they're little short guys. So their floor is the 13th floor, which most people can't get to, but if you're in the right state, you find yourself on the 13th floor. But if you're normal size, you have to be stooped over because these are little guys and they've designed it for them to fit. So in this dream, I'm in a basement. It's dark and it's kind of damp and moldy. And there's a cement cinder block ceiling on this basement. And I kind of send my awareness up to see if I can get above this ceiling. But there is no above. It goes forever.
Huh.
It was horrifying. I mean, it was one of the most horrifying experiences. Some kinds of scary experiences lead you to an opening or different awareness. But this one, I realized I was stuck there. When I woke up in a cold sweat from the dream, I realized that this was actually the drugs. And continuing with the drugs would keep me no higher than the vegetable realm. So I had a firsthand experience knowing what it would be like if I happened to go forward or get back into the drugs, which I never did.
Yeah.
My drug of choice is sweets. I'm still struggling with that one. So, okay, so maybe that's enough for today. We can do more if you're willing sometime or want to.
Well, I wanted to ask you a couple other questions, if you have time. Are you?
What time is it?
It is 2:40 Pacific time.
Okay, I need to stop it now because I have to take, oh, it's 2:40, not 3:40. Okay, we got plenty of time. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Have you been to the World Congresses?
Yes, everyone that I could attend pretty much.
And anything special happened during the World Congresses that you can?
Always something special. Not the kind of experience. I later on had some spiritual experiences in the Ladihan and normal states of consciousness. Just a few, but very big ones. At the World Congresses, I always went expecting something fine to happen, and something fine always did happen. But nothing like, the absolutely overpowering experiences that I had a few times after Aladihan.
Mm-hmm.
But always feeling of opening up to the people. I think I went a little bit astray because I always wanted to sell my art, which is a good thing to do at a Congress, but I think it distracted me a little bit from the rest of it.
Yeah.
I was partly good and partly bad. Partly good because you need to be distracted from your attention of needing and wanting to receive. So it's partly good for that, but partly bad because I spent maybe a little too much time hawking my wares in a booth and, being involved as in a commercial bit.
So you mentioned after Ladihan, you had some very special experiences. Can you describe something like that?
Yeah. Okay, yeah, sure, I will. Well, I went for about 20 years without having any kind of mind-bending experiences, you might say, or soul-widening experiences, like I had with drugs. Went for about 20 years, and when Baba came, in the early days when he was still with us, he would say, if you're not experiencing the Latihan too well, go to a certain part of the room. And when he came to Skymont, we were in a big barn on the edge of a cliff, which later on burned down, but we could have several hundred of us in that barn, and we were there. And Baba said, okay, those of you who don't feel you're receiving too much, stand in one corner of the room. So I did, and I closed my eyes, and after a little while, I kind of peeked around. I didn't see Baba anywhere near me. I thought, well, I don't know, maybe he doesn't really notice me or is very attentive to my state or what's happening. So the Latihan finished. There were three wives. There was Maxwell Shorter's wife, Risa, my wife, Helena, and Lauren Lorner, who's one of the other people that came to Subud through me. He's in Indonesia now. He's had a very remarkable life too. But the wives were there, and they were all very pregnant. Their bellies were really popping out. We were sharing a motel room too. And I went back to him and I said, did Baba notice me at all? Did he, did he try and help my Latihan along? I didn't see him anywhere when I was peeking. He said, yeah, Baba stood right behind you for the longest time. So still, it was not too much. So I'll flash forward to another experience where I was, again, a driver for Baba. I didn't drive Baba that time. He was in Hoboken when he was visiting Hoboken at the Stevens Institute there. And I was actually the house warden, so to speak. I was taking care of the house. I was kind of in charge of all what people were doing in the house. I didn't have to do too much because being someone in charge, you don't do anything if you can. You just kind of make sure nothing goes off the rails. And but after the time, Baba again was doing his tests where people were receiving remarkable experiences. And so I went to Helena Busak, who was a national helper at the time, and I said, Helena, Baba always says, well, now you have some evidence. I said, I have to say I'm still kind of not there. So she said, well, Baba's going to LA next. Why don't you come out and I'll give the message to Sharif, and Sharif will put you in front of Baba again, and he can watch your Latihan and see what happens. So it was at the old LA Hall at Hope Street, big building, big hall. Baba was up on stage, and again, there were a few hundred men doing Latihan, but Sharif invited the three of us. I was one, Bakr Lomel was another. I don't know or remember who the third person was, but he invited us to come up front and stand so Baba could observe our Latihan. And as it's happening, I kind of feel my right arm wanting to go up a little bit, but then my mind said, nah, you wanted your right arm. No, that wasn't it. So my right arm would kind of drift down and then would start to drift up again. And I hear Baba in English saying, yeah, more. And Sharif is translating, yes, more. So I try and let myself go, but my mind is still questioning, this can't really be it. It's just too nothing to be it. It had to be a big experience for it to be it for me. Mm-hmm. But the next day, Sharif is coming down the aisle after Baba. And I'm standing next to the aisle as Baba entering the hall, and Sharif is following him. And Sharif comes over to me and he said, yeah, Baba said, don't worry, you've received the opening. It's just you need to do plenty of exercise. He says your body is cold. You need to do plenty of exercises and eat more meat. So I never became a vegetarian. Before I joined Subud, I was a vegetarian for a couple of years. But I never went back to it after that, in spite of Helena became a vegetarian. Occasionally she'll eat meat. Um, so still I wasn't very satisfied. And every time Baba came and he said, now you have evidence, in my own mind, I was saying, no, I'm sorry, Baba, I don't really. But after 20 years, Ruslan Gelman, who you may know about or have heard about, he was a very successful psychotherapist in Europe. He was from Algeria originally, but went to France and became employed by a very large French banking company to do development workshops with the teams of bankers at each bank throughout France. And he spent years doing this, and his main approach was through the family relationships. He helped people realize through family relationships where they were stuck, essentially. And people had quite remarkable experiences, therapeutic experiences. And Ruslan told me some later time that Baba actually, he said, Baba, do I have permission to do these workshops with Subud members? And Baba said, yes, you do. In fact, it can help to open them to the Ladihan, which to me was kind of a unique thing. I've never heard anything about like that. So anyway, I decided to attend a Ruslan Gelman workshop with 5 other Subud New York members, and it took place at my home, and my daughter and her friend did the cooking, and Ruslan had a room by himself, which he needed to process the day's happenings. And in the first couple of days, he laid out the family relationships, so what it was like to be an older son, which I was, and a middle person, and sons and daughters, and you know, what was kind of normal for people in different positions in the family, what kind of struggles and stuff they came up against. And each of us went through that, each of the 6 of us. And at the end of, it was, I think, a 3 or 4 day workshop. But at the end of that, he said, well, would anyone volunteer to be a guinea pig for what's going to happen next? So always being wanting to find out, that's why I was taking acid. I raised my hand and sat down in the chair, which Fritz Perls actually invented this in Gestalt therapy. It was called the hot seat. So I volunteered to sit in the hot seat. And Ruslan said, well, what's coming up for you? Is there anything you'd like to, I think it was ask one of your parents. So when I was a kid, at around 7 years old, my father came from Germany, by the way, as a teenager with his mother. His mother brought him over. But he still had a lot of the understanding of what a good person should be from the German culture. And when I got to be 7 years old, my father said, I want to stop hugging you now. And I said, why, Dad? I couldn't understand. I mean, hugging is a beautiful thing. And I hugged both my father and mother. He said, you're getting to be a man now, and men don't hug men. I got over that after the first couple of months in Subud, when some Subud brothers came up and hugged me. And I said, wow, you know, that's great. I've been missing this all this time.
Yeah.
So I became an inveterate hugger. I am to this day.
Yeah.
And sometimes other people I realize are not. I'm a person in the group who I don't hug at all, because when I tried it the first few times, he didn't want that. Yeah. So that's fine. Okay, so Ruslan says, is there anything you want to discover? So I said, Dad, why didn't you want to hug me after I was 7 years old? What's the reason? You know, you told me what the reason is, but men don't hug men was not a good reason. So I'm sitting there thinking, this is ridiculous. I'm supposed to be my father, actually, you know, answering this question. I'm not my father. I can't do this. But Ruslan is carefully watching me, and he notices that my right thumb is twitching slightly. He said, you know, your thumb is moving, let it go. And just let it go wherever it wants to go. So after my thumb started to twitch more and more, my hand started to move kind of violently. And then my other hand came up and was moving the same way, like with tremendous frustration. And then I clenched my fists and I made a kind of thing. Now, okay. At that particular moment, a bunch of stuff started to happen to me, spontaneous stuff. I should mention that that weekend was the 100th anniversary of the Statue of Liberty as well, which is a big symbol for me inside.
Do you know what year that was?
It was 1986, the 100th anniversary of the Statue of Liberty. 10 years after so it was, I guess, 1886 that the Statue of Liberty made its first appearance over here. It didn't get completed for quite a while. All parts came, but at any rate, and they raised money for the base among school children and industrialists. Anyway, that's another story for another time.
Yeah.
But so, okay, so when that happened, I'm doing this, and something in me realized that my father did not have the ability. His father actually never married his mother and lived separately from them pretty much from the time my father's natural father set them up in the house nearby the residence of his natural father. The family felt that his natural father was of a higher class than his natural mother. So he was not allowed by the family to marry his mother, but he took care of her for quite a while, set her up in a house, went to see her and my father up to about the age of 5. I realized that he didn't know really how a father and son should relate past the age of 5 or 6. And that's what kicked in when he told me that. It was also at the same age when I knew I wanted to be an artist, and he didn't know yet what an artist should be in life. But when that's happened, I realized this, that my father didn't have any way to understand this relationship in that way. And at that moment, my right hand shot up into the air, and I was the Statue of Liberty. I was looking down on the New York harbor, and I saw the little boats on a golden river of light coming under the Statue of Liberty, and I felt their gratitude rising up the Statue of Liberty. And I felt rays of light shooting out of my head like a shooting out of her head. And I felt the tremendous gratitude of those people. And all the time, the tears are pouring out of my eyes, not like I'm crying almost, it's like a fountain has been released inside of me that's causing these tears to flow. And then the vision shifted, and it shifted to my father as the American eagle, the other symbol of America. And he's flying through the stars at a tremendous rate. My father had died by that time. He died in 1979. So in 1986, he'd been gone for about 7 years. But I am him at that moment, and I'm shooting like the bald eagle through the stars, and they're rushing by on both sides at a tremendous rate. And this is tremendous feeling of release and freedom, which is the primary virtue that my father always felt that America had. He never talked to us when we were little about his life in Germany. We never found out much about that until later on from my mother. But there are lots of stories everywhere. But Helena wasn't there. She was up teaching dance at a camp in Maine. But the next Tuesday, I went to Latihan at the New York Center. And a big thing happened. So I'm in Latihan, I'm doing the usual thing. I stand up, get quiet, surrender. But something different is happening than ever happened before. I'm aware in my head of thoughts that I like and thoughts that I don't like. So the thoughts that I like, I'm trying to hold on to them. And the thoughts that I don't like, I'm trying to push through and get to the next thought that I like. So I'm involved in kind of a wrestling match with my thoughts. But then I noticed that the two kinds of thoughts are actually having a dance with each other. It's kind of a spiral dance. They've linked arms and they're dancing with each other in my head. And I am watching this. I'm not part of it.
Mm.
At that moment, my awareness moves down into my heart. And the same thing is happening with emotions. There are some emotions I like and I want to hold on to them, and some that I want to get rid of and I want to push through and get onto the better ones. And the same thing happens. I separate from the two and they're dancing. The dance is still going on in my head. I'm aware that that's happening. The dance is happening in my heart. That's happening. And then my attention moves down to my midsection. And the same thing is going on there, but it's with bodily feelings, nice bodily feelings and really uncomfortable bodily feelings are going on in my midsection. And, but the same thing happens. I separate from them and they perform a dance. And then I realize that I am dancing. It's kind of hard to realize I'm dancing. I'm fully in Latihan. My eyes are closed. I'm not aware of what's going on, except that I am dancing. And at least three parts of me are dancing. And then I hear the words finish, which we said in those days. Somebody says finish, and I come out of it. And looking around, and like, what happened? But I'm not the same as I normally am. I'm like two. There's me kind of walking inside of me and saying hello to people and whatever as I walk out of the Latihan room. And there's kind of me next to me watching all this happen. And it's quite remarkable. And then the guy in the group who gives most people the most trouble, and there's one in every group. Sometimes I'm that person, I suspect, but there's somebody who's known for that in the group. He comes up to me and said, would you like to share a cab? His apartment was up, he knew I needed to go to Grand Central Station to catch a train up into Westchester, and he needed to go to 57th Street to his apartment. He said, you want to share a cab? I said, well, we'll share a cab. So we hailed a cab, we got in the cab together. And usually it was like he got his hooks into me. It was very hard to have a conversation with him. I felt I was always being manipulated in some way. I learned why. I mean, his life to survive, he had to be this way. He grew up in communist Hungary and he was a champion swimmer. He brought Simone Garand into Subud, by the way. And he had to keep it under wraps. He once even played a game of Russian roulette where one of the 6 people died because they shot themselves with a real bullet. But he had lots of stuff in him. But anyway, he was really tough to be with because it was like he was trying to control you and manipulate you.
Who
So
was it?
I'm not going to say who it was because it's, I think he's later ascended probably due to his good merits in life, but I don't want to say who he was.
Okay.
But I'm riding along with him and we're having a conversation and it's like, he's not affecting me in the usual way at all. It's like there's 2 gears. There's one gear inside of me and there's 2 gears inside of me. One of them is connecting to his conversation. I'm speaking with him and his gear is engaged with that gear. And the other gear is turning around just like in a kind of dreamy fashion, watching the 2 gears engage. I'm not being, I'm feeling peaceful and happy riding with him in the cab. So we get to Grand Central Station. He said, okay, I gave him my share of the fare. And he said, have a nice day. And he took the cab back up to his apartment. I walked down into Grand Central Station. And what was happening, and this always happened to me when I was having the outer, always connected with the inner. It was a perfect complement to my inner experience. So as I walked down into the station, I realized something was not right down there, something very strange. Upon entering the door, there was a very loud, raucous annoying sound, like a siren going on. There was a bad smell, kind of smoky, acrid smell. It was very, very hot. The AC wasn't working. And there were thousands of people all kind of pressed in together, kind of in very close proximity to each other. So all of this is going on in the outer, all these things that would normally disturb my senses were going on, but I'm at peace. So I'm drifting down. I figure I got to find out which track my train's on. There's announcements that the tracks are all changed because there was a fire on one of the tracks. And this is what's causing the upheaval. It's mid-July, so it's super hot, but I'm not feeling uncomfortable. It's bad smell, but I'm not feeling the smell. Not noticing anything unpleasant. I'm just kind of drifting down, almost like a particle in a flow, in a stream. And I'm drifting down between the people, and I'm finding my way. So look up to the board. I don't think I can quite see what track my train is on. I think I drift over to the information booth and find out which track it is. So I float down to the people next to the gate, and there's a bit of a wait for the train, for the gate to open, so I go down and sit down. So some of us are standing there, but there's this bit of open space, and I'm in heaven. So before you know it, a young woman comes out of the crowd. She is she's selling Reverend Moon. Do you remember who Reverend Moon was?
Yeah.
He was getting kids to leave their families and give all their money and possessions to him. He bought a hotel in New York where they were all living together, and they would go out with his little book and wanting you to join, proselytizing for him. So this young woman comes out, and she's got the book in her hand, and she's starting to proselytize that I should become a Moonie. And in my state, I say to her, I'm not feeling upset. Usually I try to kind of off that person. I'm not interested in it. But I didn't. What I did is I said, well, that's nice, but tell me about yourself. So immediately she gave up Reverend Moon and started to tell me about her life. I don't know how long that happened, but I was interested. I always like people's life stories, so I was interested.
Yeah.
It might have been 5 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. I don't know how long this went on. But all of a sudden I had a feeling. I think that's time for me, to go to my train. So I said, it's really nice talking to you and hearing about your life. I think it's time for my train. So she said, thank you. She went back into the crowd. I turned around, faced the gate open. So I walked down, found my seat on the train. I sat down and I thought, wow, is the rest of my life going to be like this?
Yeah.
And it lasted for about another half hour. It gradually faded as the train took off, and I went back to, I guess I was living with my parents at that moment, still early days.
Mm-hmm.
No, it wasn't. It was 20 years later. Why was I going? I was going to Long Island, I guess, to visit my parents. They were still living there. And, or maybe I wasn't. Maybe it was Westchester. I'm conflating now. I guess it was Westchester that I was going. Grand Central Station, it had to have been Westchester because the Long Island Railroad went out of Penn Station. So, okay. So I went back up, and by the time I got back to Chappaqua, which is where I was living, it had evaporated pretty much completely. But I had the experience. I knew it was there.
Yeah.
Some of my impatience was gone. And I had other experiences that, I went up to visit Helena at camp. After this experience on Tuesday, I think I went up the next weekend. I was still working. So I went up on Friday to be with her at camp. I told her about my experience with the Gelman workshop. I don't know if I told her about my experience going with the cab, but she heard about it, and she was remarkable. She wanted to do the Gelman workshop too, which she later on did. And we made love in one of the times that it was like completely free that night. And that was kind of a week after everything else happened. And we we were on vacation. We went visiting the shore in Cape Cod, it was in Maine, the camp. It's called Maine Teen Camp. So we went to the shore. We spent a night in a bed and breakfast, and we had a really nice 5 or 6 days before I returned to New York. So that's a brief précis. And the experience did come back in kind of minor ways now and again, semi-minor. I mean, there were still lovely experiences when I experienced being free. One time was I went to hear a concert by a couple of Subud members in New York, Yuri and Tanya Hrenishin. He's not Yuri anymore, but as far as I know, they're still alive. And I know Yuri is, we communicate every so often. But I heard they were part of a really fine choir, and they were singing a beautiful piece. And after leaving the concert, I was walking down. I was living in Manhattan at that time, I think still. Or whatever. Maybe I was walking to the train. Anyway, I was walking someplace, and I was in that state of elevated peace and happiness as I was walking down for the train. And it happens now. Almost always when I'm listening to music, I have something of that, or if I'm doing my pictures. And that's why I do pictures, so that when I see something that is beautiful, I have that hit again. And it's a feeling of, oh, that's beautiful. And then I feel gratefulness, I feel gratitude. So at another time, I'll tell you my gratitude experience, which happened shortly after I was opened in a semi-dream state, not a real dream, but I learned at that moment what worship is. And there was a drug experience that made me wonder if there was such a thing as God. I always kind of believed in a God, but this drug experience said that I was the only being. And what does that mean for God and God's existence? And what about worship? And is there such a thing? So shortly after I was open, it was in August, it was 8 months after, not 8 months, 5 months after I was open. So that I had this experience. So if we talk again, I hope we will. Yeah. I think that experience needs more time because there's a backstory to that one too. Why I wondered whether there was God and whether there was worship and could I experience worship. And in that experience, I did experience it and knew that there was something beyond me. It wasn't just me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you got into doing your art, these amazing pictures that you're doing now?
Yeah. Well, when I was little, my mother is a very fine artist. I say she is because her art still exists. I was little, and I think when I got tall enough so that my chin could clear the dining room table where she did her art. She was primarily a housewife, not a professional artist. My father brought in all the money, but my mother continually did art, and she did it on the dining room table. So as soon as my chin could clear the top of the dining room table, she put out a piece of paper next to what she was working on, gave me some crayons or whatever, and said, go to it, see what you want to do. And when I was doing it, I thought, wow, this is the best. Couldn't be any better than this. And that was also confirmed because when I was in first grade, I guess I was 6 years old at the time, my mother, the teacher heard that my mother was an artist. I was very proud of that fact. So she invited my mother to come to school and to give the kids a demonstration, an art demonstration. So my mother came and she taught the kids how to draw a horse, starting with 4 circles. So every kid in the class, and there were maybe 20 of us, after my mother got done, could draw a kind of a horse, certainly much more of a horse than the stick figures that they had been drawing for horses. And the kids loved it, the teacher loved it, and all the kids wrote thank you notes to my mother, and I carried them home to her. And I saw that art was also very valuable and important in the world. This was something really good. So during elementary school, I continued with art. I became enthralled with birds, especially the birds that I saw in the Museum of Natural History, fancy birds like birds of paradise and peacock, all the kinds of birds in the Museum of Natural History with these amazing feathers and, things that the little guys have up here, little partridges. And some of them are super fancy, their tails, the lyrebirds went out like that, colors, and oh God, I was enthralled with birds. So I started to draw birds from my mind, fantasy birds that got more and more fantastic as I was drawing them, and loved looking at the birds outside the window at home, and then expounding upon them and, taking them through my own visioning of what a bird could be like, making pictures. So that went on till about, I guess it was fourth grade. And art wasn't a subject that was taught. It's changed now. I went back to my elementary school some years later, and the halls were plastered with the kids' art. But in those days, art wasn't a real subject. We might have gone down one day a week for a half hour or an hour to play with putty or whatever. Paints, finger paints, I guess, was the first thing. And we did get some exposure. And I was amazed with finger paints because, there you were, your hands were directly connected. You could make these remarkable things with your hands.
Yeah.
So anyway, it was in fifth grade. I remember the grade quite clearly because of what happened in the other part of life. Each class, and I don't know, there might have been 10 or a dozen classes in the school, was given an assignment to make a picture of the moon. And we all did. I loved it because, here's a chance to draw. So my moon was really developed in detail. You could see craters, this and that and the other thing. And the pictures went back to the art teacher. And I learned that I was chosen because of my moon picture to have special art. Special art. Special art. I could be relieved from class on a Friday afternoon and spend the last part of the day, 2 or 3 hours, doing art down in the art room with the art teacher.
Wow.
And so I realized that art could be part of school, but you had to be specially interested in it. Nowadays, I see that they've changed that completely, and they realize that there is value in visual expression. But so I continued for some time until we were given a social studies assignment on Thursday afternoon to do Thursday night. But I realized that I wasn't going to be there when the social studies assignments were being talked about and collected. I was going to be in special art, so I didn't do the homework. So the next day, the whole class went down to special art. It was kind of strange. Why did the whole class go down? It was because a movie was being shown, an artistic movie. It was a movie about the Canadian loon. It was a beautifully animated picture. It was wonderful. But the movie took maybe a half hour to show, 20 minutes, a half hour. And then everybody was going to go back to class. But I didn't follow the other kids back to class. I stayed down. It was my right special art moment. So I'm down there, I'm fiddling around doing something. And I guess my teacher must have realized I didn't come back with the class. So all of a sudden I feel this vice-like grip on the back of my neck. And he is marching me back up to the classroom. And he sits me down in the back of the room to do the social studies assignment. So I got a kind of lesson about, art wasn't really there. It was kind of there, but as it related to social studies, which I later on, at least at the elementary level, had really very little value. We were learning the culture of our resident culture of what our minds and hearts knew. We weren't really learning about social studies. But at any rate, I did the homework. It was easy. I didn't want to do it at night. I liked watching TV. I finally could convince my parents I was a good enough student that I could do my homework while watching TV. That actually wasn't as good as it might have been, but I was good at convincing people and I had a pretty strong will even at that time. So my parents let me do my homework while watching TV. So it was good enough to get B's and A's, which kind of put me towards the top of the school, not at the tippy top where I might have been if I really launched in. But I wasn't that interested in school. School was more like, it had developed as a kind of prison, to feed to feed industry back in England in those days. And my spirit knew that it was a prison. I couldn't decide not to go to school to do something that would be more apparent. I wasn't asked what I wanted to learn and shown an interesting way to learn it. No, that wasn't going on. It somewhat is coming. It's taken over a fair amount now, and it's coming into general practice, and not soon enough as far as I'm concerned, but it's coming. And yeah, so that was 5th grade. When I got through elementary school and went into 7th grade, I think we still had a once a week elective that we could take. That was an art course. We could also take other things having to do with like home economics, and learning how to sew and cook and things like that, which were also considered kind of secondary skills in school. It was only the intellectual pursuits that seemed to have some value. Well, because those were honored, you could get to the top wherever the top was with those skills. I'm beginning to learn that the top is often the bottom. And in my study, brief knowledge of what vortexes are, I can see how that can shift. But anyway, so I got to middle school, and art gradually faded from the picture. And I got interested in science, and kind of gave up drawing and painting. There was no support for it anywhere that I could see. But I took it up later in college. It was my sophomore year. One of my fellow dorm mates was taking an introductory course, and he was doing charcoal drawings. He had this big pad and charcoal and eraser and stuff, smooching it around. And he had it in the room that night, and he was trying to draw a little something. And I said, well, can I try that? And he said, okay. So I took it up and I tried to draw him. And it was a big struggle to try and get anything that kind of looked like him. But when that charcoal got into my hand and the pad got in front of me, I had that feeling. I knew that was it. That was it.
Yeah.
And so I started to take more and more art courses in college, kept on with my chemistry, but knew that art had to be my career. And so I was taking art courses at college. And when I graduated, my professors, for my final audible exam, I had to go up and be questioned by them, given problems. They knew, and I knew, that I wasn't going on with chemistry. So they asked me a question about color. Why do things have color? I was able to give them a rudimentary answer, but anybody else, they would have failed their that. But for me, they passed me. So I got my graduate degree got my undergraduate degree in chemistry from Middlebury College in Vermont. But when I graduated, I knew I didn't want to be a chemist. And the only thing I really knew how to do was to be a student in school and learn courses. When we got done with college, I met a friend from Minnesota at a mutual friend's wedding in Connecticut. And after the wedding, I think we had agreed on this beforehand. He was going to drive out in his car, and we were going to drive back together to his parents' house in Mankato, Minnesota. So after the wedding, we drove back to Mankato, and I had a little bit of money in my pocket. I think we left did we leave his car there? I don't remember exactly. I knew at one point we had to hitchhike. I guess we must have left his car. Maybe we got a ride with friends or something from his hometown to a place further west and south. And finally, we ended up in Arizona, and we were let off out in the middle of the desert as night was coming on. There was thunder and lightning and clouds off in the mountains. And we had heard that there was a flash flood in the place where we were left off. And I could see where the grass had been flattened by the previous night's rain. And all this thunder and lightning, and it's raining in the mountains. You can see it again. It's getting dark. And we're getting a little bit worried, you know. But a car comes by. It's a truck, actually. And it's kind of a beat up truck. And there are two guys in the truck. And they say, "You want to ride?" And I said, "Well, where are you going?" "We're going to San Diego." And we sure did. We wanted to get to the West Coast. That's where we were headed. So, so they said, "Well, get in." Okay, so we got in, and for a while, it's kind of a beat up old truck, and it becomes dark. And the headlights start to go out periodically. And what do the guys do? They stop or slow down? No. They start pounding with a screwdriver on the dashboard, and the lights flicker on for a little while. They come on, and then they go off again after a while. So we're riding around with these two guys, and then we head up into the mountains where it gets really curvy. And as you're looking around, you look off to the right, and there's a 2,000-foot drop. And this thing is happening with the lights still. And they don't seem to be concerned about this. They keep banging on the dashboard, and the lights come on again for a while. But fortunately, after a while, we came down out of the mountains, down into the flat area again. And the two of us who had been, you know, our hearts were in our throats for this time, and we're holding on for dear life. They said, "Well, where do you want to go?" I said, "Well, let us off. We're going to San Diego. Let us off in San Diego." So we got off. Hotels and motels were really cheap. We always got the cheapest one. The cheapest ones were $2 a night in those days. I think we got a $6 a night. We treated ourselves, and we kicked off our shoes. We're like, "Oh, we're here." And anyway, there's lots of stories too between now and San Francisco, but we went up to San Francisco, and my friend felt he ought to fly back home and become part of the family business. And I felt I ought to continue if I could. And I had $100 left in my pocket. So I took a flight out to Hawaii. And that was the story about, you know, becoming an art student in Hawaii. And then getting back to New York afterwards, having been an art student, but not having any particular idea about how to make a living. I got my first job with a kind of art thing through a Subud member named Jace Walsh. Her daughter is still in Subud. But for a while, I was part of a cooperative art gallery, and we were renting an apartment in the East Village at a very low rent, and we were always 2 months behind, and we would split the rent 3 ways from our takings from the art gallery which didn't sell pieces very often, but when it did, we had enough money to pay the back rent, put some cereal and unperishables in the cupboard, and have a celebratory meal at the Pink Teacup, which was a soul food restaurant just down the street from our art gallery, which is on Bleecker Street. I was on Charles Street, just off Bleecker. So, so that was my life until, how did it happen? She was working for Burlington Industries as a stylist, and she had 3 artists working for her in the studio. One of them quit, and she had an empty chair. He was experienced, and she wanted an experienced designer. But she had an empty chair for 3 weeks while she found another experienced designer. So she said, "You want to come up and design for 3 weeks up here?" And I said, "Sure." I had no experience at all in textile design. I did a few screen printing projects in Hawaii, but I knew nothing about it really. So she said, "But you got to get here in secret, because I don't have budget for another person up here, and I want to hire somebody with experience. But I can pay you a little bit of money if you get here before the executives get here. Just get to the studio, and I can give you some work for 3 weeks." So I started learning a little bit of the craft. I was very proud. I was an artist, and this is kind of a lowly profession. But fortunately, there was one of the other artists was a Japanese guy. And when I didn't know something, he tried to explain it to me, it was so hard to understand his language that I had to listen very carefully. So I got to pick up some of the hints that he was giving me about how to do some of the basics. So I was there for a while, and these execs had come from Wamsutta, and they had become very successful in licensing cartoon characters for sheets and bedding. So they were continuing with that at Burlington. They had gone to Burlington. They had accepted hire. One of them was the president and the other was the VP. And they were bring on cartoon characters. Casper the Friendly Ghost was the first one. But the other artists in the studio, they didn't want to do that. They were turning up that this wasn't real design. But I love cartoons, and I said, okay, I'll do it. So I did my first layout for Casper the Friendly Ghost, and I was able, I knew how to use tracing paper and pencil and how to make a design and even how to turn it over. I was taught, make a rub down so the pencil came out on the paper. And so I did a little painting of what was called the turn back on a sheet. It's what you turn back on the top sheet. And there was a little Casper and his friends in the cartoon were kind of gallivanting along the turn back. So I took it up to be approved by the licensing company that was doing Casper. And so I was given the address. I took my design under my arm, and they were at 7th Avenue and 57th Street up in a loft. Usually, you go to a licensing agent, but I realized when I got up there that these were the inventors of Casper that were going to approve my design. Huh. So I enrolled it in the later ones I did many for Burlington because it was so successful. But they looked at this and they thought, well, they said, very nice, congratulations, but let us make some adjustments. So they pretty much changed the whole design, but they did it in such a kindly way that I was able to accept it. I took it back down and was taught, I think I made my first repeating design with Casper, and Kuni, the Japanese guy, Kuni Kaya, was helping me to figure it out. So I made the designs, they were approved, maybe mostly redrawn by the originators of Casper, but they came out in the next market. And Burlington was new in the sheet business at that time, and they were trying to break in, but none of the retailers wanted to see any of the Burlington patterns because they had already had enough vendors, and they didn't want another vendor to contend with, and they didn't like the somewhat normal kind of fancy designs. So, but when my design in quotes for Casper appeared at the market, the buyers went crazy. They all had to have Casper. And the president and vice president were looking at this and Casper, who made this? Who's the genius who made this Casper that's finally got us Burlington on the boards for sheets and pillowcases and curtains? And so they went to the stylist, Jace, the Subud member, and they said, who's this genius who did this Casper? They said, well, here he is, it's Robert Mertens. So they took her aside and said, well, how much is he making? I think it was $125 a week. I was being paid weekly. Oh, no, can't raise his salary. He might raise his salary. So this happened for the next 4 years. They kept raising my salary. I kept doing other cartoons. The apotheosis was Roadrunner. But at the same time, they were trying to get the license for Peanuts. It was up for grabs, but the Peanuts people wanted too much. They wanted a percentage of the take. It wasn't, they wanted a lot of money up front. So finally the exec said, okay, we're not, take it someplace else. Take it back to Wamsutta. So they came out with a very, by this time over 4 years, I had developed the comics into a real art form. Some of them were done in the format of comics. And I mean, I was a star in Burlington and everyone sold. Everyone I did, everyone sold. So I was very important. So they gave Peanuts over to Wamsutta and the design came out. It was very clunky. I mean, there was no development at all in the design, but it was a smash hit. So they said, you could put Peanuts out there with no clothes on, it would be a smash hit. So they realized that then it wasn't Robert who was the genius, it was the characters. I mean, I did a good job. I did some nice designing, but it wasn't me that was causing the success of this.
So how did you get into your current?
Okay, so on weekends and well, after a while, after a few jobs, I kept getting fired from jobs. I got fired from that one eventually when they realized I wasn't really that experienced a designer and I made some mistakes. And so they fired me. And then I went to another place and I wasn't that experienced. So I got fired again. I actually dreamed, and my mother dreamed I was going to be fired beforehand. And I kind of knew it was going to happen. A series of events kept moving me from one job to another. Over the next, let's see, that was around 1970 anyway, over the next 10 or 12 years, I got one job after another. It'd stay 3 or 4 years in most jobs. And then in the fashion industry, you go out of fashion after a while. So you got to look for a new job. And, but when I was at Dan River, though, something was coming continually because of the hippie thing. What time is it now, Helena?
It's 3:33.
Okay, I'll come in 5 minutes.
Yeah, just giving you time to finish a story.
I'll prepare. So at Dan River, I was able to take some homework. They realized I was able to do some fancy work at Dan River. And I actually got prizes and appeared in the textile journals for amazing designs. So I was kind of becoming a star again, because what was wanted in the industry was what I was naturally doing, fantasies. You know, I was doing fairies and gnomes and elves, and I was putting them in flying environments and stuff. And it came to be that sport shirts, the biggest sport shirt companies became interested in what Dan River was showing them of my work that I was doing at my bench during 9 to 5. And they also began to give me then take-home work so I could do more of these designs. And so for a couple of years, I would take them home and I'd get my friends, the Strasbergs in New York and Helena, to help me color in these designs I was making so I could make more of them and produce for myself and my employees a bit of additional income during that period. But then, as always, the style started to change, and it was men's shirtings, tiny little geometric figures put in very precise. And my hand wasn't really good at doing these. And by that time, I had risen to become assistant stylist and, you know, a star at Dan River. But the fashion had changed, and I couldn't do these other designs as well as someone more experienced in doing shirting designs. So I got fired again, and they hired the shirting guy. And it was at that point, then I got a job as a stylist at JP Stevens. And the stylist directs the work of other people. It was a private ticket stylist, which was Sears, Pennies, and Wards at that time, which was the biggest single client of Stevens in bedding. So I had really the most important job, more important than the general stylist who did the open market designs. So I said, okay, I'll take the stylist job as long as I can keep doing designs. But it became apparent after I did a design or two, but it became apparent after a while that my need was to direct the other designers to make designs that Sears, Pennies, and Wards wanted to buy. So designing slipped away from me at that time. I still would do my own work, whatever I wanted to do on weekends, and did. But that was not that good either, because it also kept me away from my family when I wasn't at work. But at any rate, I kept doing art and got into photography. I realized that with a camera, I could also make art, and I could do it very quickly. And I could also, I worked with slides, so I could make dreamlike images by sandwiching slides together, like my daughter's over a night scene or something. It was kind of magical and mysterious. And I could print. I had Robert Vervoort in New York do printing on Cibachrome of these things. So I had kind of artistic images that satisfied me. I occasionally would show them in a show, and occasionally would sell them and that kind of stuff. So what happened after that? Finally, I guess J.P. Stevens was my last job. I was so successful at J.P. Stevens as a stylist because I loved my work and I really worked hard, and I stayed after hours to make presentations for Sears and Penny. So I was quite successful. So when one of the executives, some of the executives were raided from Stevens to go work in a new company as a division of a larger company at Sears. It was also kind of a partner. It was formed originally by Sears. They invited me to come over and become design director, in quotes. Hmm. And the people at Stevens were really angry. And they agreed to raise my salary, but it was only a little bit. And I said, how come it's so small? We've been such a big success. They said, well, we're only allowed to raise the salary a certain percentage a year by Stevens. Hmm. And I thought, oh, well, if you're only allowed to, and that's the situation here, I'm going to take this job where I'm called design director and I'm doing everything. Hmm. So I did do everything. Everything from working with consultants to do the showroom design, to do the advertising, to commission the designs from artists that became our products, to go to the factories, to do the sample printing, to presenting them to the clients. And I was pretty successful there too, because I was wanting to do new stuff that they couldn't get from the other suppliers. Again, they didn't want a new vendor. The buyers didn't want a new vendor, but they began to see that I was doing different stuff and they thought they'd try it out. And it was going pretty well for them. But as happens with many kind of startup companies or divisions, we had fancy offices and we're spending a lot of money on everything, including me. So finally, the main company decided they had to close the division because it had been losing money for 2 years. So after 2 years, I was out of a job again, and I just bought a house. I asked the president of our little division, is this going to go on? You know, I'm about to buy a house and I need to know that my income is going to continue. So about 3 months later in June, they closed the company. He knew that this was happening, but he didn't tell me. And so I was kind of out on my ears. So what could I do but go freelancing? But fortunately, I had a little bit of a rep in the market. So 3 companies took me on as a consultant to help them design their, and they were newly in various areas. So I had something to offer them too, a little different, so that people would want to buy their stuff. So I did that for a couple of years, and actually I made more money for a couple of years than I had some royalties, advances. So for a couple of years, I made more money than I did as an employee. Hmm. That eventually came to an end too. I became a rep for an artist, and I was designing groups of products, casual dinnerware, everything for the home, and taking from him, being a rep for him with the companies that he was hoping would license his designs. So I was creating the themes and the key designs that they could evolve for each of his potential licensing customers. And they also liked what I was showing. So I got working with him, and his work became very successful, partly through me. And I was getting a piece of his piece then. So for a number of years, I was doing really well until he decided to take it in-house. But I was still doing my own art on the side, photography pretty much that time for about 20 years. And I was going more and more enthralled with the beauty and potentials of photography, particularly with flowers. And so this was going on, but after a while, he didn't want to employ me and give me a percentage anymore. So he brought another artist up to Vermont that did all his design work for his licensees. And there were about 40 of them at that time. But he continued to pay me for a while, a pretty high amount per hour, like something like $90 an hour in those days. That was a lot of money. And I went with that for a while until I realized that no, it was becoming less and less. The stream was drying up. So I closed that one off. I said, up till then, everybody else had always closed off whatever was available. God was making them do it because I didn't want to leave. I wanted the security. But at that moment, I decided, no, I'm going to go on my own.
Yeah.
And about that time, Cherie Paris was coming back from the World Congress. I guess that one was in Bali. And he was wondering what he was going to do next in his life. And I was wondering what I was going to do next in my life. So we got together and we decided he could rep me. He could be the salesman and I could make art. And I had just at my end of my time being a consultant for Warren Kimball, the artist in Vermont, I brought the computer in so my son could do computer layouts on the computer. And I didn't know what the computer was, but my son could make layouts and things quicker than I could do with tracing paper and pencil. But he was a musician, so he was going on tour. So he'd be absent. So one day I walked over to the computer and I hunted down the start button and the computer lit up. And I looked at that and I said, wow, what can I do with this? So I started to fiddle around with Photoshop. And I realized I could flip things. I was beginning to make flops like Safwan Sherpatel did with his photography, but I was doing it in the computer. And I was like, wow, look at those things. Now I could do this by just taking an image and flipping it in the computer. So I made flops and I imported some of my photographs into the computer and started fiddling around with it. So that's how it got started.
Mhm.
I didn't know anything about the computer, but I was fascinated with what I was seeing and realizing I could do stuff that I could never do with paint. I did paint for a long time. And I got pretty proficient at doing textile designs, so proficient that I was able to mimic the old master Dutch painters and their flowers and had some designs approved and put into production with some of my paintings of old masterpieces. But this was something new. So that was the beginning. And maybe I have to go upstairs and get ready, otherwise Helen will be tapping her fingers.
Before you go, do you agree that I can show other people this video?
Absolutely. Use anything you want or any part of it, edit it in any way you want. So long as you don't change the reality of it, so it doesn't come out meaning something entirely different. But yeah, use anything you want in any way that you want. I'm happy for that.
And I will send you a copy of it too.
Great. I'd love that. I can show that to my grandkids, pieces of it.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Rahman. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, me too.
And if you want to do it again, let me know and we'll go into it further.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.